Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this USENIX tech session on postmortem of a zombie Conficker after 6 years. My name is Asghari. I'm from Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. And the fact that you're seeing this video recording means that I didn't get my visa in time. So I'll be doing this through a video. And actually at the end of the video, I will be taking a number of questions through Skype. And hopefully on Friday, I'll be here in person so we can have follow-up discussions. So the main idea of this paper and what we looked at was what happens to bot-infected machines after the command and control infrastructure is disrupted. So, as you all well know, botnets have been a major issue over the past few years, and there's been a lot of interest in the security community about reverse engineering them and stopping them in different ways. And often the latest works are presented also in USENIX, where there has been some really impressive reverse engineering and basically getting into some kind of botnet and eventually finding a way to take over the command and control server or disrupt it, etc. And this is really great because it kind of removes the botnet from the control of the attackers. But what actually happens to those zombie machines? So the idea for this paper came from the data we got access to from the Conficker working group, where they have been basically tracking the Conficker botnet from the early days, around 2009. And we received access to this, and we thought, well, it would be really interesting to look into this question. So as you can see on this slide and on this graph, this is the number of IP addresses seen in the Conficker sinkhole per day from February 2009 till now. And still, in 2014, over 1 million IP addresses could be seen each day in the Conficker sinkhole, which is quite a lot. Understanding that this botnet came out in late 2008, it spread via Microsoft Windows vulnerability and in later versions also via local shares and USB devices. So the botnet was pretty good in how it would propagate, and it also used a pretty novel way to communicate with its basically controllers. And the botnet grew at a really fast pace. Already in the first few months, millions of machines were infected. The internet community was very worried. So they set up very quickly a working group, which in many ways was really magnificent. There was a lot of voluntary work between a lot of organizations, and they managed to reverse engineer the malware and also come up with this list of domains and actually take over the domains every day. And in this way, basically the botnet was taken out of the control of the attackers. But as you can see from this graph, the number of infected machines remains relatively high. And this was well known to the working group themselves already when they released the report in 2010. They reported their number one failure as remediation. So what can be done? Around the same time from 2010 onwards, there's been another, let's say, major discussion and push more of the responsibility on cleaning up machines onto internet service providers, and a number of proposals by different industry groups, including the IETF, MAUG, etc., on this issue. And there has been also support by a number of policy think tanks on this issue. And in a number of countries since early 2010, we've had these anti-botnet initiatives. Basically, what these initiatives do is through some kind of centers, and here's an example, they monitor various internet feeds for the presence of infected machines, and when they find an infected machine, they notify the ISP, the ISP notifies the customer is then sent to a website. Here you see the website for the German Anti-Botnet Advisory Center, and basically will get help in cleaning up their machine, etc. So the question we were interested in were these countries with these national anti-botnet centers doing a better job in cleaning up configured bots or not? So the question in itself is a relatively easy question. The point was we wanted to answer it well in a valid and reliable way. And the idea is to use data from the Conficker sinkhole, which logs every machine infected with Conficker trying to connect to these domains to get commands, and it logs the IP addresses of these machines, and these machines connect multiple times a day. So these logs are rather huge, and by doing historical GeoIP and ASN lookup on these logs, we can actually see where these infected machines were located. And if we then aggregate these two country levels, and we can then compare the countries with these anti-botnet initiatives versus those without them. So that's the idea in a nutshell. But there are still a whole bunch of measurement issues to deal with. One of them, and the most famous one perhaps, is the problems caused by dynamic IP addresses. Internet service providers in some countries have policies where they assign a new IP address to a customer, perhaps once a day, or it might be even multiple times a day. And what that means is that the same infected machine would show up with different IP addresses, and we will have some kind of overcounting. These graphs show these. So on the top is a graph for the Netherlands, bottom is for Germany, and on the left side we have the number of unique IP addresses we see in the Conficker sinkhole in that particular country per day. And on the right, we show the same number of IP addresses, but accumulated per hour for the course of the week. And as you can see, although the number of infected machines are more or less stable, this second number really can grow high. The way we decided to correct for it was to use the shortest time window possible. We use hourly. This will undercount a bit, but that is fine because we want to actually compare the numbers. So if it undercounts similarly, then it's fine. Other kind of issues include missing measurements due to sinkhole downtimes. The way to solve that is we filter about 10% of the points. With regards to the effects of a NAT on these kind of measurements, major problems are caused by carrier-grade NATs, and we detected these for a number of countries like India, and we removed them from the data set. And another issue is, well, countries have different sizes. So obviously the number of infected machines with Conficker in the US is going to be much higher than the Netherlands. And that in itself is not an interesting point of comparison. What is actually interesting would be a kind of infection rate. So for this reason, we divide the counts by the number of subscribers in the countries. Now, this is what we have. As you can see in this graph, we've basically plotted for Germany, France, US, and Russia, the Conficker trends. We can see that the countries move with similar trends. There's a growth, plateau, and decay. There are systematic differences at the peak levels, and it's rather interesting what we see here. We actually went through news, media, etc., and you can't directly pinpoint what's causing these downward slopes, etc. We thought of modeling this using various ways. We looked at the epidemic models, we looked at ARMA, autoregressive moving average models, hazard models, etc. In the end, we actually opted for a rather simple model that uses basically two phases. The first phase is a logistic growth, and the second phase is the exponential decay. This model captures the curves or trends for the different countries in a number of parameters that represent what can be observed in the data directly. And this is a question we got from our reviewers: why didn't you use epidemic model X, for instance? And the main reason is those models have assumptions on, for instance, what is the rate of infections per cycle or cleanups per cycle, etc. And or some of the more advanced models include a number of latent variables which we cannot directly observe. So these would add extra complications, and it would be further from our goal, which was basically to compare the countries. So these are the results for 6 countries: Netherlands, Germany, US, Ireland, France, and South Korea. In these plots, the blue lines are the single data, the red are the fitted values based on the model. And as you can see, the numbers, for instance, are here are put. For Germany, the growth rate is 0.1 and the decay rate is 0.01. And the adjusted R-score is 0.99. And the paper contains the results for all the 60 countries that we use in the study. On this slide, what we have is the Conficker growth rate for the various countries. Each point is one of the 60 countries in the study, and these gray lines are basically errors with regards to the optimization techniques used. The red points or red crosses are the countries with the anti-botnet centers. And the countries with the anti-botnet centers, they do a bit better, a bunch of them, and a few of them actually, Australia and Korea, they're doing a bit worse than the median in terms of the growth rate of Conficker. So basically they are all over the place. And we can do the same for the other parameters. This is basically at the peak, what percentage of the machines or internet subscribers were infected with Conficker. And here you can see that most of the countries with the anti-botnet centers actually did better than the median, with, for instance, Finland and Netherlands doing really well. But that does not tell anything directly about the effects of these anti-botnet centers, because, for instance, Norway or Denmark, without these centers, they also did really well. Finally, the decay rate. So basically how the cleanup went. And here again, the countries with the anti-botnet centers are all over the place, and perhaps even strangely, a few of these countries did worse than the median, meaning that cleanup was even slower in these countries than the median. So basically we observed no evidence of countries with national anti-botnet initiatives doing a better job at cleaning up Conficker. We thought perhaps the bots are actually located outside retail ISPs, and that's why these initiatives didn't have an effect on them. What you see in this table is we looked at what percentage of the Conficker bots were in the ISPs in these different countries. And as you can see, the average is above 75%. So that couldn't explain it. The other thing was perhaps, okay, Conficker is a stale botnet, it has no priority, so these anti-botnet initiatives, they ignore Conficker. What we looked at was the overlap between another botnet which we had data on for a specific period last year, Game Over Zeus, and Conficker. And we found that if you look at the IP addresses daily, there was a 6% overlap. So 6% of the bots that appeared in the Game Over Zeus data also had Conficker, which is surprisingly high number because we also only compared it with one other botnet. And this kind of makes sense because these machines have bad hygiene in some ways, so it should be a priority. So we then looked at what else can explain these peaks and these differences, and what percentage of the computers in different countries are running Windows XP or Windows Vista, because these were basically the versions of Windows that would be affected by Conficker. And as you can see, there is actually a relationship in this graph. On the x-axis, we have the number of bots per subscriber, and on the y-axis, we have the market share of Windows XP and Vista. But the relationship, so there is some kind of relationship here, but actually if you run the correlation, it's only at 0.55. So it doesn't explain everything. There is a big variance there. And we came up with a new metric, which is infections per vulnerable user. We tested this against two factors. One of them was unlicensed software rates, so or also known as piracy rate. This is a figure calculated by the Business Software Alliance. And here, perhaps not surprisingly, we see again a strong correlation. And this kind of tells us that the important role automatic updates play in keeping machines clean, because often people with pirated versions of Windows might turn off automatic updates. The other metric we checked against was the ICT Development Index. This is a figure that's generated by the ITU, and it contains a number of things like internet broadband speeds in countries, level of education, etc. And you can think of it as a capacity to handle, let's say, ICT incidents in some ways. And here, interestingly enough, countries with higher ICT Development Index had a lower Conficker peak. Basically meaning that these countries had the knowledge, or companies or people in these countries had more skills on how to deal with infections or on how to patch their systems, etc. How does the decay rate compare with actually the change of Windows? Or the upgrade rate of Windows? Because if you change your machine, or if you upgrade your Windows to Windows 7, it kind of automatically gets rid of Conficker. And what you see on this graph is each point represents one of the countries, and on the x-axis it's the decay rate of Windows XP and Vista, and on the y-axis it's the Conficker decay rate. And in all the countries behind this below this dotted line, the decay rate of Conficker is even slower than the typical rate where machines get changed or upgraded. And this is sad in some ways, but it also makes sense because it tells you something about who is this group of people who still remained infected with a virus, with this worm after so many years. And the same group is probably also the group that changes their machines the least frequently. So, in summary, the anti-botnet initiatives had no observable impact on the growth, peak height, or decay of Conficker, and on the other hand, a number of institutional factors did. Actually, if you run the regression, they can explain about 80% of the peak. So, yeah, what does this mean? One question that came to our mind was perhaps, as I said again, does it mean that ISPs that were part of these anti-botnet initiative were not taking Conficker seriously, or perhaps these centers were not taking Conficker seriously? We presented the results actually a few months ago to a conference with members of a number of different anti-botnet working, including 2 ISPs. What they told us was rather interesting. They told us that they were actively doing something about Conficker, and they had been doing it, and this actually did show in the data because both ISPs ranked better with regards to Conficker peak than their peers in their countries. But they said that, for instance, one of the challenges were sometimes they had to notify a customer many times before they could take action. And sometimes customers would just have repeat infections. So these are interesting challenges that basically we can think of if we want to basically improve these initiatives and make them more effective in the long run. And another issue they pointed out was because of licensing issues with many binaries, they couldn't often point customers towards a simple tool where the customer could just click and that would clean up their machine. This brings us to my last slide, which is a bit more thinking about the policy implications of the findings we just described. So the infection peak can be managed. That is basically good news. The correlation with ICT development tells us that botnet cleanup goes hand in hand with also capacity building. So programs that target basically developing ICT skills at large are also helpful for botnet cleanup in this sense and in a broader picture. And the correlation with software piracy also tells us that automatic cleanups are our strongest tool. So perhaps an idea would be, for instance, to give ISPs simple tools that they can distribute to customers very easily that will basically re-enable automatic updates for this group of customers that have had their automatic updates disabled by malware like Conficker, etc. The other, I think, interesting issue is when we see such long-lived bots in these kind of data sets, this indicates that basically ISPs should be taking action against all these bots. And in countries with these anti-botnet initiatives, this can actually be used as some kind of metric or for compliance, whether actually the ISPs are notifying customers or not, or if the notifications are, maybe they are, but the notifications are not working. So it could be a way also to run experiments for tweaking, etc. So in that sense, it's interesting that we have these long-lived bots. The last, but not least, is I think that we need to also have the mindset of a marathon runner when we deal with these bot infections. So the next botnet that's going to be sinkhole, already at the start, it's good to start, perhaps appropriating funds to be able to run these sinkholes for a relatively long run, and basically to have the patience to be able to deal with these in the long run, and we should just accept that as the reality of how this works. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry that I couldn't be here to deliver it in person and the quality was not perhaps as good as it could have been. And Now I will hopefully take some questions.